Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update, the second part thereof for the 28th of March 2025. And we are going to start with Russia potentially, probably, almost certainly by the looks of the words, giving up on the ceasefire already. So Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, has said, quote, Russia reserves the right not to implement the moratorium on shelling of energy facilities, which Kiev constantly violates. So I reported in this morning's update that both sides claim the other side had violated the energy infrastructure moratorium on strikes. And now the Russian government appear to be saying we reserve the right to not to implement the moratorium. Now, I don't know whether the word shelling is important here because Kherson energy facilities were hit by artillery shelling, not drones and missiles. Is that a meaningful difference? I don't think so. And it is also the idea that they have the right not to implement it, but it doesn't mean they are not implementing it. So exactly what are they achieving by saying this? Are they basically invalidating the ceasefire with this statement? I don't know. I guess we'll have to see. My goodness. Right. I've already spoken to you at length of the insanity and the offensiveness, as Sir Bill Browder will put it, of the minerals deal that the US is trying to impose upon Ukraine, the extortion that really represents. It is terrible. No security support. US claims $100 billion in prior contribution through its grants to Ukraine, which they want paid back with a 4% per year interest rate. It's the US majority on the board. They have ultimate veto. They have the rights to everything, both past and present, in terms of, not just new extraction potentials, but actually all the existing ones as well. It's just a complete control of Ukrainian energy infrastructure. It's absolutely insane. As Null Report says here, the new US-Ukraine minerals deal could trap Ukraine into $120 billion of debt. Analysts warn under the deal, Ukraine must repay all US aid, military, budgetary and humanitarian, that has been given to them since 2022, with the sum growing 4% annually, extorting mafiosi, he says. And this is something to add, just incredible. So Trofimov that says the latest US proposal essentially turns Ukraine from a sovereign country to a property of a Delaware corporation, which would have monopoly rights over its natural resources and all infrastructure and the power to inspect all of the government offices until the end of time. Inspired by King Leopold's Congo. Obviously, there is zero chance Ukraine will accept this. And of course, it's got to go through the Verkhovna Rada and be accepted, and it won't be. But he said, just look at this extraordinary clause that would allow the US government to inspect the files of every government and private entity in Ukraine. It's just insane. So, inspection rights. Ukraine shall permit and shall cause each other relevant entity of the Ukrainian government to permit representatives or agents of DFC to examine its books and records, including relevant financial and operating records, and make copies thereof or abstracts therefrom, and to discuss its affairs, finances, and accounts with its relevant departments and agencies, including directors, managers, and other relevant employees thereof, and its public accountants, all at such reasonable times during normal business hours and as often as may be reasonably requested, to the extent required by DFC to confirm compliance by Ukraine with the terms hereof, including with respect to the compliance with and calculation of the royalty interest. If, in order to confirm such compliance, DFC reasonably determines that it must also review the books or records of a third party that is not an entity of the Ukrainian government, Ukraine shall authorize a third party to permit and shall use its best efforts to procure that, and shall require that any relevant license issued provides that any person designated by DFC in writing or any representatives or agents thereof to have reasonable access to perform inspections or audits and to respond to DFC's reasonable written request for information concerning such books and records to the same extent as if such information was held by Ukraine or an entity of the Ukrainian government. Wow, that's a lot of legalese for the US having complete auditing control over the state of Ukraine and its private entities. And of course, there's a lot of heavy lifting being done by the word reasonable there in terms of, what would qualify as compliance. Just incredible. So the minerals deal is extortion. We have had Putin say an awful lot recently as well over the last 24 hours. He gave a speech last night that essentially stated their maximalist gains again and said that actually we can't even do a deal with the Ukrainian government because they're basically Nazis. Just insanity all over. And the Americans appear to be more aligned with what the Russians are saying than what the Ukrainians are saying. Now, it's pretty incredible when Nigel Farage in the UK Reform UK leader, who has got into a bit of hot water with his views on Putin and his implicit, if not support, then lack of robust support of Ukraine, has said he's fired back. Putin is getting too much. Trump's longtime UK ally Nigel Farage isn't happy with how the Ukraine peace talks are shaping up. Quote, "It's right to aim for peace, but we can't have a deal that turns Putin into a winner," he told the BBC, criticising US-led negotiations. Wow. So if you've lost Reform UK in your attempts to negotiate peace in the Ukraine war, then you are doing things wrong. Definitely doing things wrong. He added that he's not 100% with Trump's team right now. That is a really big concession there, or admission there, from Nigel Farage. He warns that any deal must be equitable and not hand Moscow a victory. I don't even think it has to be equitable, by the way. I think it has to be just. Equitable just means equal for both sides. Oh, there are good people on both sides. No, not here. Not here, there's not. And in the same way that, you wouldn't expect if someone sort of murdered or mugged someone, you wouldn't be talking about an equitable ending to that interaction. You want, Doris, you've been mugged by Ivan. Let's just make sure this is equitable, that, Ivan, he doesn't feel too bad about it. Let's not make him feel too bad. And, is it all right if he keeps like half of your wallet, half of your purse? Is that all right, Doris? Let's be equitable about this. No, he's the freaking aggressor. He committed a crime. He has to pay the time. So I don't like the use of some of these words. Anyway, as I was saying, Putin has said a whole bunch of stuff at a conference and here as well. I say conference at a kind of speech on stage. Russia is ready to cooperate with the US, Europe, BRICS, China, and North Korea on Ukraine. Brilliant, yep. Kiev's rule is illegitimate. He suggests a UN-led interim administration. The White House, though, has said no to that, which is at least something. Quote, Ukraine's government is set by its constitution and people. That's what the US has said back. So at least they've turned down this idea that there would be some kind of replacement of the Ukrainian government. Putin said he can't sign documents, though, with the illegitimate Ukrainian government and proposed a temporary governance in Ukraine under the management of the UN in order to hold elections. He's really trying to get everything from Ukraine, and also said, they wouldn't be able to do anything until the root causes are sorted out. And of course, that's going to be the denazification of Ukraine, as I see it, the demilitarization. So we're back to, I'm afraid, square one, I think, with negotiations. It looks like, when you look at what Peskov has just said about the ceasefires and what Putin's been saying about and in fact, I don't know. No, that's about Greenland. He said a whole bunch of stuff last night, but it just seems to me that, well, I would hope that the US would realise that they are negotiating, who they're negotiating with now, really. I hope they've come to a proper realisation that Putin isn't serious about peace. He is still serious about maximalist objectives and achieving those. And he sees the US as the best way to achieve those objectives. On the other hand, the EU has remained strong. We talked about the coalition of winning this morning, and how their rhetoric was very strong in terms of keeping the sanctions on Russia, keeping them upheld first of all, and then increased as well. So they're already preparing their 17th sanctions package against Russia, according to EU Observer. The EU is awaiting proposals from the European Commission on these new sanctions, although it won't be presented until early summer, but they're already working on them. So the coalition are winning. Let's quickly run through what the conclusions to it were. So key European leaders stressed that it was not the time to start lifting sanctions against Russia and called out Moscow's delaying tactics in responding to US-led ceasefire proposal in Ukraine, and we heard that from Starmer himself. Macron outlined the structure of the future security guarantee proposed by the coalition of the willing, with further support for the Ukrainian army, a reassurance force stationed away from the front line but offering support in strategic areas, and a broader push to rearm and coordinate better among the participating countries. That's seen as like the three pillars of support there. French President Emmanuel Macron said there was currently no unanimity among all participants in the Paris summit on sending a European-led reassurance force to Ukraine, although he stressed it was not required to advance plans for its deployment. He said that Europe must prepare for any scenario, including one where its security initiative would not be supported by the US, but he appeared to repeatedly suggest that US President Donald Trump could change his mind once it becomes clear that Russia does not engage with his plans in good faith. And that's an interesting point, because we might get to a point where Trump gets frustrated with Russia and starts taking out on Russia. Or we get to a point where Russia generates this scenario whereby they can blame Ukraine. So the minerals deal is part of that. It could be so ridiculous that Ukraine rejects it, and then that gives the US permission to go hard on Ukraine. Or that there's a false flag operation like we've seen potentially last night with Sudzha gas metering plant getting attacked. That could well have been Russia that did that to make the US aware that Ukraine has broken the ceasefire, and so the US goes hard on Ukraine. It could go either way. Let's hope that Donald Trump comes to his senses. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer confirmed plans for French, British and German army chiefs to travel to Kyiv to help them with the planning support for future Ukrainian army as part of the broader push to offer reassurance to the country, and a new Ukraine Defence Contact Group meeting, so Ramstein, to marshal more military aid and keep Ukraine in the fight, and that's happening on, I think, the 14th of April. Starmer also repeatedly called out Russia for playing games and playing for time, saying he would want to see programs in days and weeks, not months and months. And Ukrainian President Zelensky warned that Russia does not want peace in Ukraine and seeks to divide Europe and America, as he urged the US to take a stronger line and impose sanctions on Russia for refusing to accept an unconditional ceasefire, and called for a reaction to Moscow's repeated violation of limited agreement arrangements already in place. Zelensky also said the US was constantly shifting its approach to the minerals deal with Ukraine, but insisted that Kyiv remained willing to and sending positive signals on the agreement, which is a far cry from actually signing it, of course. Now, Maria Drutska talked about all the conclusions as well. Let's just run through a couple that might not have been included there. Sorry, actually, no, this is the synopsis, and this is really useful synopsis of Zelensky's point from the press conference afterwards. So we will go through all these points. So this is what Zelensky said. President Zelensky said the US keeps changing the terms of the critical minerals agreement. It seems we had agreed on a framework deal followed by a full one, and now the US is proposing to sign a full agreement immediately, which requires further review. He also says there will be no lifting of any restrictions against Russia until the war ends in a just peace. This is a signal from European countries. According to Zelensky, the number of countries willing to contribute to peacekeeping contingent is increasing. He said, quote, security guarantees are one of the main topics of the summit. France and the UK are key accelerators of this process. These summits are laying the foundations for peace. Also, we will open production platforms for drones, not only in Ukraine, but also abroad. So that could be Ukrainian entities working abroad to give them greater safety. Ukraine's position is very clear. Europe must be at the negotiating table when it comes to ending the war without exception. We are not considering other initiatives. Zelensky noted that France and the UK will represent Europe. Putin is not ready for direct negotiations. We are not afraid of any format of talks. We understand the complexity. So that's putting the onus on Russia there, saying that Putin is the one that is not really ready to negotiate. On the negotiations in Saudi Arabia, he said, quote, it was important for us to unblock assistance, regain access to intelligence, and demonstrate that we seek to end the war through diplomacy, to stop further loss of life. And I wonder whether that, the intelligence that the Americans withdrew the intelligence sharing, I think might be really, really key. On a temporary ceasefire, he said, I don't believe these are reasonable agreements. Today, there were strikes on Kherson, on the train station and the energy infrastructure. The city lost power. I believe there should be a response from the United States. So there's an interesting synopsis there. Now, we started to hear, as I mentioned yesterday in a live stream with Jonathan Fink, we started to hear major European politicians actually go hard against the US, like we've heard from some people within the US not the US administration, but the US political landscape, like Jim Hines as the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, I think it is. Close Merz ally here, this is Kiesewetter, warns against territorial concessions and criticizes the potential revival of the sabotaged Nord Stream pipelines. He has accused the US of switching sides on Ukraine. That is a big, bold thing to say out loud, and I think it needs to happen more. I think that the US needs to come to a realization that everyone really accepts that they have functionally swapped sides. What do they really think about that? Let's start putting these lawmakers on the spot, and indeed Donald Trump and JD Vance, to get them to answer honestly about what's going on foreign policy wise. Yeah, we know that JD Vance hates Europe and etc for whatever reason, but and it wasn't always thus. There's an interesting interview on the news agents where they had a former friend of JD Vance saying, no, he used to be enamored by Europe. So this is kind of an ideological shift that's happened. But German Chancellor Olaf Scholz says, what we need to do now is the obvious thing, which is to continue to support Ukraine directly. The point is that we are very clear that the sanctions will not be lifted now, and we insist that Russia does not keep looking for new excuses, and we make every effort that Ukraine has a strong army, even in peacetime, to prevent an attack. And it's good to hear Scholz say that. Phillips O'Brien here, historian and analyst, casts his opinion. Europe needs to understand that the way Trump is treating Ukraine over the new mineral deal, trying to rob them blind but give Ukraine no security, is how he will deal with Europe as a whole if he sees them as weak. The only way to deal with Trump is defiance, not bridge building. This is where Europeans are being foolish. It's not that they need to convince the USA to stay as their leader. That's actually inviting disaster. It's better for Europe to get out from under US leaderships. This is responding to the claim that the UK has denied rumours that the US is giving up on command of NATO forces in Europe. And this might be the idea as well that the UK wants the US desperately to stay in Europe as a NATO leading force, as integral in the command and control of those NATO forces. But actually, Phillips O'Brien said, look, let's stop and he's an American, by the way, let's stop pandering to let's Europe stop pandering to the US and just have a hard break. It's clear. Just look at how they're acting here and there. Look at what they're doing with the mineral deal. That's exactly how they feel with Europe. It's all transactional now. Now, the EU not only looking at putting stronger sanctions on Russia, but has unveiled new sanctions against Belarus in response to the presidential elections that just took place. They've introduced new sanctions against Belarus yesterday as a result of the repression that Lukashenko is responsible for. Now, talking about repression, the massive protests that have been taking place in Istanbul. I've never seen such clampdowns in Istanbul. Turkey's democracy is fighting for its life, says Orhan Pamuk. It looks like they're going now. They've actually left the protest to get on with their own kind of thing for some time, but you were expecting that they would go hard against the protests at some point, and here it is. I wonder whether Erdogan might be thinking in fairly cynical, clever ways here. Like the harsh, if he's a democratically elected leader that is wanting to democratically backslide and incrementally move towards autocracy as the years go by, in a much slower way than the US. Goodness, the US has only been doing it for 8 weeks, and they're going in leaps and bounds. But Erdogan, is looking at what's going on around the world, sees the absolute chaos in the US political system, looks at the trade war bubbling up all over the world between the US and everyone, looks at what's going on with the Ukraine war and the chaos that has brought about, that Russia and China are being pitted against Europe and the US is all over the shop. If you were wanting to do a few autocratic things, like lock up opposition leaders, like really clamp down heavily on the freedom of speech in Turkey, now's your time to do it. Like, if Erdogan wants to take even more power now, I think this is going to be as good a time as any, because this is also the time where Ukrainian allies are looking to Turkey to be a really important component of the peacekeeping forces and of the allies of Ukraine. Like, Turkey actually more recently has been moving away from Russia, rhetorically speaking, and towards Ukraine and Europe. I mean, what a clever thing for Turkey to do is to play themselves into being a really vital part of this setup of the defense of Europe and the defense of Ukraine, the support of Ukraine. Absolutely integral part. And they say, now you rely on us. Now you can't be seen to criticize us too much because you need us. Now's the time where I'm going to take even more power. Which will absolutely enrage the Europeans there, the EU. So yeah, incredible. Well, that's me being like super cynical. You know, it might be what's on Erdogan's agenda. Now, good news that I talked about the Megabarri Act. This is a US act that's being passed through Congress to support a stronger democracy in Georgia, and actually the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So what happens quite often, particular acts or bills, or this is how I understand it anyway, they often go through particular committees to see whether they are, decent enough, and then they vote on them, and then that gives an indicator for the rest of the Senate, and then it will go to the House of Representatives. So anyway, the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so not everyone in the Senate, has passed this bipartisan bill to hold Georgia's Russian Dream officials accountable after the assault on Georgian democracy and violence against protesters. The Megabarri Act just passed the committee vote unamended. So they also have a chance to say, actually, this needs to change and that needs to change. But actually, in a completely unamended form, it passed that committee. So that's a good sign for Georgia. Now, UEFA is reportedly considering allowing Russian teams back into international football. Since 2022, Russia's war in Ukraine has killed nearly 500 Ukrainian athletes and coaches and destroyed over 500 sports facilities. And yet UEFA, just like the International Olympic Committee, are doing what they're doing. Okay, now we're going to go to the US to see what's going on there, and with some relationship to Ukraine. But it's worth noting that we're going to start with Elise Stefanik. So who is she? Well, she is the nomination, Donald Trump's nomination for the ambassador to the UN. She's got an interesting past in terms of relationship to, I think, Trump. Is she one of these ones that was more critical of Trump in times gone past and is now completely kind of capitulated to MAGA? But I don't want to take a chance on anyone else running for Elise's seat. Okay, well, this is worth pondering on a little bit. So he says, as we advance our America First agenda, it is essential that we maintain every Republican seat in Congress. We must be unified to accomplish our mission, and Elise Stefanik has been a vital part of our efforts from the very beginning. I've asked Elise, as one of my biggest allies, to remain in Congress to help deliver historic tax cuts, great jobs, record economic growth, a secure border, energy dominance, peace through strength, blah, 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 blah. So with a very tight majority, I don't want to take a chance on anyone else running for Elise's seat. The people love Elise, and with her, we have nothing to worry about come election day. There are others who can do a good job at the United Nations. Therefore, Elise will stay in Congress, etc., etc. So she's a representative in the lower house, in the House of Representatives, and there is indeed an insanely tight, one person moving. Is it 215, 217 still at the moment? So if one person was to lose their seat, that's 216. Oh my goodness. So what why this is important. This is incredibly important. This is an admission that actually from Trump and the Trump administration that the polls and actually the sentiments in the electorate are not going their way at the moment. This is much bigger than you would think. You might think. So he's saying, right, I'm going to keep her in the House of Representatives. Well, it turns out that in fact, I think I've got things in the wrong place. Hang on. Yeah, here it is. So she, Randy Fine pollster Tony Fabrizio, who was also the chief strategist on Trump's 2024 campaign, has done a private poll showing Fine is only up. So Fine is a person that will replace Stefanik in her district. And actually, this is wrong. They make a correction here. It's actually 3 points down. So that this is a GOP internal survey. So usually these would be kind of somewhat pro whatever party. But actually, it's showing that the person who would replace Stefanik is 3 points underwater, which that, you know, is a huge difference, because in February, that person, Fine, was 12 points up. So Fabrizio's poll has showed a 15-point shift in basically a month. That is huge, right? So they've gone, okay, polls are looking bad. Do not let Stefanik leave her congressional seat. We need to hold on to that razor-thin majority in the House of Representatives. But then add that to this. So a special election took place in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania. And in this county, which Donald Trump won by 15 points in the election, and where Democrats haven't won in 136 years, James Malone flipped a state Senate seat. So this isn't a national Senate seat. This is a state Senate seat in Pennsylvania, but it's kind of reflective of what's going on. Now, this was a huge victory and actually was a really big points shift as well.
Speaking to people's real needs and real issues, he talks a lot about the housing crisis that exists, and not just for low-income individuals, but for the teacher that can't find a home, all right? The nurse that has to do Uber driving after their extended shift. He talked about the very real issues. Now, understand that he's talking about those kinds of things while the overwhelming ecosystem in the political environment is Republicans and Musk and Trump stealing the Social Security, reducing health care, cutting education, denying people food. That's in the ecosystem everywhere you go. People are angry, people are fearful, they're anxious, and they took that out on election day. That's how James Malone ran. Very simple. There were no commercials. There was no advertising. There was basic retail politics, speaking to the hearts and minds of people, not to this craziness that always seems to permeate much of American politics.
So not huge money involved in this. This is a kind of an organic representation, or representation of the organic move of the electorate. In this case, it was a 16-point shift from plus 15 to -1, as if you're Republican. And then you've got the 15-point shift or so for Fine in the Stefanik seat. These two bits of data show that the last 2 months has been pretty disastrous for the Republicans, even though it seems that Donald Trump's approval ratings are pretty good, but they are good for his base. If you're talking about independents and swing voters and Democrats, then absolutely not. And there's an awful lot of anger out there. And it's all to do with stuff like this as well. So I showed you the video of a student with a green card who had written a critical essay on war crimes in Gaza, or policy in Gaza, who was literally arrested on the street by undercover people So I don't have to agree with what this student wrote. That's not the issue. You do not snatch someone off the street over an op-ed. That's the kind of thing you see in China, Russia, or Iran, not in the United States. This is absolutely disgraceful. And I was saying that this is amazing. I assume this is exactly what happened. Well, it definitely is what happened, because we've got Marco Rubio talking about it. Marco Rubio on Rameza Ozturk. We revoked her visa. Once you've lost your visa, you're no longer legally in the United States. If you come into the US as a visa and create a ruckus for us, creating a ruckus is writing an op-ed that was critical. I mean, what the hell is happening to the United States and freedom of speech? Don't you dare of anyone that before the election was like, oh, the Democrats are anti-freedom of speech. I'm a free speech absolutist, Twitter, blah, blah, blah. I believe in free speech, and then as soon as you get into power, you're like, oh, you wrote something you didn't like, we're gonna arrest you, handcuff you on the streets as you're walking down the street. We're gonna arrest you, bundle you away, and then if you understand what the process is at the moment, then you're done for. You're whisked off. You don't have access to this. You don't have access to that. You should listen to Jasmine Mooney, the Canadian actress who spent 2 weeks essentially in custody. You should listen to her account, and being in chains and handcuffs and no access to this. And she said, I was speaking to people who were being legitimately deported, if you like they didn't have an issue with being deported, she was saying, but it's the process that they were going through and the complete lack of humanity. And these people, they've been working there for 10, 15 years in the United States. They've built up a home and all their furniture and all this stuff. That's all gone. They'll never see that again. They're out the country. They won't have the money to get any of that stuff shipped back. This is just, it's just a way. It's about processes, isn't it? But anyway, I just think this is also unconstitutional. This is just completely unconstitutional. If you come to the US as a visitor and create a ruckus for us, we don't want it. We don't want it in our country. Go back and do it in your country. In other words, if you want to say things that we don't like, you don't have the right to do that. We will ship you off. Even though they do have the right to do that. That's precisely what the First Amendment gives them. And it gives people on green cards the ability to do that. It gives tourists the ability to do that. You can't just have a conversation in a bar as a tourist. If I went to the US on holiday now, there's every possibility I'd be shipped off. I'd be whisked away from a bar, overhearing me slag off Trump. Right, we'll get rid of him. This is a dictatorship. We hear Bill Browder says a Russian scientist who opposed Putin's war, fled Russia, found work at Harvard University, was detained at Logan Airport returning from a French academic conference, and has been sent to an immigration detention center in Louisiana for deportation to Russia. What? So you're sending him back to a gulag? I mean, whose side are you freaking on here? Absolutely incredible. The Trump administration is concocting justifications to lock up and physically abuse legal immigrants to the US whose opinions they don't like. However, how long before they start concocting justifications to lock up and physically abuse US citizens whose opinions they don't like? New York Times reports as Trump broadens a crackdown, there's a focus that expands to legal immigrants and tourists. Like I've just said, as US border officials are using more aggressive tactics at ports of entry as the administration scrutinizes green card and visa holders who have expressed opposition to its policies. Wow. Just wow. This is happening, guys. What else do we have? The Trump administration appears to have sent a married father with no criminal record to rot in a prison in El Salvador because of a paperwork error. So what we're saying about the Venezuelan gang members who are rounded up, sent on an aeroplane and sent to this prison in El Salvador, the criticism was that there was no process there and there's no attempt to prove that these people were who you say they were. And they have no right of appeal or anything. So this is basically down to ICE, to having faith that ICE are going to arrest the right people. And then just, 100% of people we sent there in those 3 planes and put them in prison. Yeah, they're definitely all bad people. Yeah, what evidence you got for that? Oh, someone handed me a list of who to arrest. Okay, so where's the evidence? Where's the process? There is none. So it turns out US government claims on Reyes Motors I-213 form, a document the Department of Homeland Security uses to support that someone is deportable, that he, quote, may be a Tren de Aragua associate, so maybe a gang member. But in those same documents, the government says he has no criminal records or immigration history in the United States. The government also uses someone else's last name in several parts of the document, identifies him with female pronouns, and uses 2 different unique identification numbers that immigration authorities use to keep tracks on individuals, raising questions about the reliability of Trump's officials' accusations against him. That seems like an absolute quagmire of BS in terms of how much reliable justification they have for locking that guy up and throwing away the key in another country. So it's got to the point where Yale professor Jason Stanley, I've read Jason Stanley's book on fascism, how fascism works. I've even shown you slides from presentations from him and talked to you about his 10 pillars of fascism before. I've done whole segments on videos on Jason Stanley's work, right? He's an expert on fascism. Yale professor who studies fascism is fleeing the US to go and work in Canada. Jason Stanley, who says grandmother fled Berlin with his father in 1939, says the US may become a fascist dictatorship. And then you're looking at stuff they're doing on the ground. So they voted in the Senate. It's going to the representatives now. But in the Senate, they voted very closely. But the Republicans voted because they got a majority there to get rid of Biden's cap on overdraft fees. So the cap was, I think, $5 overdraft fees. Is that $5 a day or something like that? So they've now voted to get rid of that. Who does that benefit? I wonder, does it benefit consumers or big banks making big profits to screw over the most vulnerable in society, the people who are most likely to have overdrafts? It's just insane. Why would you do that? Unless you're A, a complete bastard, or B, you're a complete bastard and you're taking money from the banks. Well, it turns out that commercial banks donated $24 million to elect Republicans last year. Today, Republicans voted to end the cap on overdraft fees. This is what corruption looks like. Joining the dots. What else? Trump's executive order tonight has illegally cancelled union contracts on 67% of federal workforce and 75% of unionized federal employees, roughly 700,000 union workers. This may be the single biggest attack on the labor movement in American history. So you've got to understand what's going on here. There is an ideological purge. There is a Project 2025 attempt to de-unionize, give power to the corporations, give power to the billionaires, give power to the banks, take power from people. Look at what they're doing with regard to the judiciary, to the universities, but also now they're going to make it even harder to vote by looking at the paperwork you're going to have in order to vote, which is going to skew towards or skew against people of color, people the bottom end of the socioeconomic strata, so on and so forth. Just insane. And then, when you look at that corruption and the amount of money that the banks have sent to Republican politicians, actually now when you look at how much money was raised, because before there's like an awful lot of money advantage that the Democrats had over the Republicans, but that was predominantly coming from small donors. When you start looking at the big donors, it's rather different. Bernie Sanders says, this chart says it all. If we're going to save American democracy, we must stop billionaires from buying elections. We must end Citizens United, which was a terrible court ruling that allowed money back into American politics, and move to public funding of elections. Completely agree with this, by the way. But just look at these figures. So the maroon color is someone who is solidly Republican or conservative. And the dark blue is someone who's solidly Democratic or liberal. And then beige is leans Republican. I presume light blue is leans Democrat. But, okay, there's a couple of Democrats there. That's quite a bit of money. It's over 100 million. Look at the amount of money these people, Elon Musk, Timothy Mellon, Miriam Adelson, Richard and Elizabeth Uihlein, Kenneth Griffin, Jeffrey and Janine Yass, Paul Singer. Wow. Just Elon Musk, almost 300 million. Timothy Mellon, 200 million. Miriam Adelson, 150 million. Why are they giving that much money if they don't want some kickback? And you can say the same for all of the people on that, no matter what side of the aisle they are on. And this is why I think money needs to go out of American politics, or all kind of democratic politics. We can't do that in the US, in the UK, thankfully. But it's just that is just insane. But then you get this situation like the Signal scandal, and then nothing being done about it. To which Chris Murphy, watch him, I think he's going places, says that well, this is what it says.
I was glad to hear one of my Republican colleagues in the Senate, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, say there's got to be an independent investigation. That's good. But this is criminal behavior, right? They likely violated multiple laws, the Espionage Act, the Presidential Records Act. And so there has to be criminal investigations as well here. I mean, if the criminal code doesn't apply to powerful people, it only applies to people without power, then we don't have rule of law in this country. And so you're seeing the unfolding scandals of this administration start to overlap, right? When the Department of Justice has been turned into, as it has been, just a political arm of the White House, this is what happens. People in power believe that they can get away with crimes and telegraph to the American people that they're going to continue doing it while the law continues to apply to everybody else. So we have to have a larger conversation right now in this country, not just about this discrete scandal, but about how the rule of law doesn't seem to be working in this country as it applies to the people that are close to Donald Trump.
And you put all of that together in this direction that the US is going in, and this is where I map it back to Ukraine. And then I've got a whole other section here on trade wars and Canada and Greenland. I'm not going to do in this video, right? But there's a whole bunch of stuff going on whereby the US is attacking its allies, it's attacking its own people, it's purging, it's doing this, and it's aligning itself with places like Russia in really obvious ways, and doing what Viktor Orban has done, taking leaves out of Viktor Orban and Erdogan's books, right? And I mean, if I was American, I'd be absolutely desperate right now, just like feeling powerless just right now to be able to do anything against the wrecking ball that's been taken to democracy, to freedom of speech in the United States, to the rule of law, to norms and mores and processes, to institutions, to just being cleared away. Why and who for? Well, if you go and check out my video of Melanie Stansbury laying it out, who for billionaires, it's a total scam. It's a total scam taking place in the US political landscape at the moment that is to the benefit of billionaires and grifters and nefarious people and dark money and broligarchs and Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and Andreessen and Jeff Bezos. All of these, David Sachs, all of these people that I have very little time for, they're the ones that have supreme power, along with Trump himself. It is a super worrying time. And we're looking at Ukraine fighting for what is good and right and fighting for democracy and ideals of transparency. And you've got the US going in entirely the other direction, stopping aid to Ukraine and joining the other side. As Kieswetter says, as Jim Hines has said, I can't see it any other way. They've just done a complete 180 shift, flip the American administration, and they're moving at breakneck speed towards autocracy. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. Anyway, that's enough of me banging on there. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you for people like Michael Winkler, as I've said before, and Mark Bisque and all the wonderful people who support the channel. I really tremendously appreciate it. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you relatively soon.